Welcome to our podcast. This is another recorded episode of Stay Classy San Diego, with video production and studio provided by MaxLux Media at maxluxmedia.com, with your host being myself, Steve Wire, a freelance reporter. This podcast is dedicated to fostering quality dialogue surrounding all things local policy in the North County, San Diego area. Join us weekly as we interview political leaders, analysts, professionals, and community members on issues ranging from homelessness to housing to elections. Today we bring into the studio Bruce Ehlers. Bruce is the city councilman in Encinitas, District 4. He's also the senior executive at a consumer electronics company, and he is a 38-year Encinitas resident. Bruce, before the city council, was on the planning commission for Encinitas, where he was the chairman. Thanks for coming on to the show, Bruce. I appreciate having you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So first thing is, since the election, it's been, about 2 months now or so?
Barely,
I know, if you can believe it.
More like a month.
More like a month. We had a conversation before the election when you were running for office, and now we're having you on again to discuss sort of your agenda, your goals for city council, sort of how you found your time on the council so far, even though it hasn't been so long. But first of all, just to sort of rewind, I'm curious to know, like, looking back at the election, obviously you won commandingly, and I'm just curious as to your race, the other local races, even some of the regional races that were happening, just sort of your takeaways. Like, what do you felt like the election sort of sent a clear message, the voters sent a clear message in the election? Was it sort of mixed, or just what were your takeaways?
Well, I've been following elections even before my election. I've been following them for 25 years, so I spent a lot of time looking at what happened in previous elections and comparing and contrasting what happened here. To say a commanding lead, it was a good, healthy lead. It would have been hard for my competitors to overcome the lead I had. In the other campaign, the other elections in Encinitas, obviously the Joy Linda's lines and Julie Thunder race was close. I think in the end, if I look at the numbers, 100, less than 200 votes.
About 180 votes.
180 votes, yeah. So that was pretty close, and on that, and then of course the mayoral election was Tony Kranz had quite a commanding lead there, and so that was not in doubt at all. But you have to look at the dynamics. What would have happened had the 180 votes swapped, and we'd have a very different council under that condition. Mm-hmm. And so I think that shows that Encinitas, as I think everybody would expect, is a mix. It's a mix of various demographics, various political parties, and various independent nature. And that right now I think I represent one contingent, and whether it's 40%, 50%, 55%, I don't know. And I think we may have representation of much of the rest. Maybe have more people on the council. That could have shifted significantly had that election gone the other way. So I guess that's a public service announcement that get out and vote. And
sure.
A lot of people did, and that was great. And so we all abide by whatever the majority vote is.
Sure, absolutely. And did you have any thoughts on any of the regional races? The former mayor, Catherine Blakespear, won a narrow victory over Matt Gunderson for the 38th Senate race. And I know you weren't on the council with Blakespear, but you worked with her as a member of the Planning Commission to some extent. And I'm curious, that election or some of the other regional races, did you have any thoughts or takeaways as to sort of what?
Well, I thought the Blakespear race was actually closer than I expected.
Yeah.
So, and especially given that Matt Gunderson was a newbie to politics completely, and really didn't have. I would have loved to have seen him debate. I actually thought Catherine would do very well in a debate, and it would have clarified the issues even better. But I thought she had probably more knowledge of those issues than he did, or would in depth. Obviously because of the experience and time, and it was close. But as I said, we get to listen to the voters and abide by the results, and she won fair and square.
Sure. So once Tony Kranz took the mayoral position, he left a vacancy in District 1 in the Leucadia District with only 4 members of the council at that point, and that would be you, Joy Lyons, Kelly Hensey, and Tony. So the council had a decision to make. They had the decision to hold an appointment process to fill that 5th seat or to do a special election. The council ended up going with the appointment process. And those deliberations, which happened in the last month, ultimately ended in Allison Blackwell being selected as the 5th member of City Council. So I'm curious to know, what we can talk about Allison in a minute, but I'm curious to know just how you felt about the process overall in terms of appointment versus election, and then the appointment process itself. How was that fair? Was it equitable? And did you think that process reflected the will of Encinitas?
So let's talk about first the process was all happened in open session on the 14th of December, I believe, is when the selection of, sorry, which day was that? In January, sorry.
Yeah, January.
January. That, and I made a point there, and I'll repeat it here. It's very hard for council, an elected council, to select the same person that the electorate would have selected themselves. And I believe that the purpose of the appointment is just an expediency or a way to save money in order to allow the council to select that person in lieu of having to go through the significant expense of an election. But it's hard. It's hard because we all walk in there with biases, and we all have people we know and people we don't know. And I gave an example, or I gave a hypothetical scenario. What if Joe had resigned 6 months or a year and a half earlier than the election?
Term. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the bottom line would be this council, the previous council, had just taken me off the planning commission. Moreover, most of them, and it may have been all of them, endorsed my number 1 competitor.
Yeah.
I contend that they would not have elected me, or not have appointed me, even though the electorate overwhelmingly elected me. And so that, to me, was proof that, if you're going to go with the appointment process, which I didn't agree with, I voted for the election process. If you're going to go with the appointment process, you're probably not going to get the same person that the electorate would have selected. So that's why I was an advocate for spending the money to have an election. Just because I believe, as I referred to a little earlier, that we have a pretty good mix of all sides, and I don't think that is fully reflected today in the makeup of the council.
Sure. Now, I think the pushback people on the other side would have to that is they would say that the council members themselves, are the people's representatives, and that they have a mandate from the people to make this decision. And so, in that sense, the appointment is sort of a reflection of the democratic processes that got those people elected. But what would your kind of rejoinder to that be?
Yeah, my rejoinder to that is that incumbency imparts an advantage going into any election.
Sure.
Right. Some people don't agree with that. I looked up academic papers, found quite a few at the city level talking about how incumbency does impart an advantage. We currently have three members of our council who were appointed first. 2 of them were subsequently elected by the electorate. The most recent one by a fairly small margin. And so I would argue that I want to get away from that. We don't have the people that are on the council now have been duly elected. Allison's been appointed, but the others were subsequently duly elected. But they went into those elections with an imparted advantage. I called it the anointed incumbent, and so it's an advantage from one side, and we've seen that 4 times recently, and I think I would like to see. I think one of the points I made during council meeting talking about this is I would like to see that whomever was appointed be appointed with the agreement that they don't run or can't run in the next election. Delmar, Carlsbad have that exact rule in place. Now there's a little legal issue construct. We'd have to change to be a charter city to do that.
Okay.
which is fine. But maybe we could address that in the future.
Sure.
But so that's something that I would be for. I'm not sure my current council would agree with that.
Sure.
I'm sure they wouldn't.
So you and the minority were in favor of holding a special election to determine that 5th representative. Now, given the appointment process that happened, how did you feel about that process? Like the actual hearing itself, the deliberations that were made. You voted, correct me if I'm wrong, for Glenn O'Grady.
I didn't vote for him, but I nominated him.
You nominated Glenn O'Grady.
I did a substitute motion.
You did not vote for Blackwell. You were in the minority 3-1, excuse me.
Yep.
And so obviously you disagreed with the outcome, but the process itself, did you find equitable?
Equitable. So let me comment on the process itself. So what we're trying to do in doing this, again, is replace an election, right?
Yeah.
During an election, there is a lot of time and effort spent by the candidates being vetted by the public, by the press, in podcasts, in interviews. I think the standard question I must have been asked half a dozen times, what are your top 3 goals? You get that asked that over and over, and you put it into writing, both in your ballot statement and in your brochures and in your emails. You repeat what you're doing, what your plans are, where you stand. You get asked about specific issues and you respond. That all gets well documented. We're trying to replace that process of vetting with one-night interview and a resume. Yeah. And I thought Tony provided a very telling comment that night when one of the audience asked, what kind of vetting is occurring? And he gave the factual response that, hey, the city looks at, do you really live there? And are you a registered voter? And that's about it. And so all the vetting that was occurring came from, and he went further. He actually said, whatever's on the resume, we don't know if it's true or not. Hopefully it's true. So bottom line was we needed to ask questions, and I asked quite a few questions. I think I asked every candidate, what are your top 3 issues? Do you have the time to put into this? Can you commit to, because it's a time-consuming job, and that's part of this is you got to be there and do it and talk to the electorate in order to really fulfill the job. And that I thought that was a minimal amount of vetting compared to what an election would do. And I did what I could do in the time available.
Sure.
So my comment about, do I think the process was fair? I think it was as fair as it could be. Was it thorough enough? Hey, time will tell, won't it?
Mm-hmm. You did.
By the way, a couple other comments just to add on. One, as I said that night, I could work with any of them, including Allison. I think she's a wonderful person. Number 2 is the applicants we had were top-notch across the board. We had very qualified people applying. So there wasn't only one right answer. And I think Allison is a very good person, will make a great council person. I think several others would too. I think others were maybe vetted more.
Sure.
And that's why I recommended and tried to nominate Glenn O'Grady. He'd been on the Planning Commission for 10 years. He'd been chair of the Planning Commission. And the important point, so he'd been vetted quite a bit. And through all these controversial projects, nobody ever questioned his integrity. And I thought that's a really good sign. So
yeah,
Allison is a good person, just maybe has less of that vetting.
Sure. Last thing on this is about, I did say we would talk about Allison herself for a second. What do you feel as far as her qualifications for the role? I imagine you've met with her in the subsequent days after the process. And I'm just curious to know, sort of what people should expect out of this new council member.
I'm probably not the best one to comment. I have, let's see, we met last night, talked in a little training session on how to push the buttons, that kind of stuff. We talked for about an hour at Pete's before the nomination. I met with as many of the candidates as I could. So I don't know that she seems to be a very capable executive in the HR realm. That gives her a lot of good tools. She's got a law degree. That gives her a lot of good tools. She's certainly well respected by people around her. So
sure.
as I said, I think there were quite a few people that are qualified. We just hadn't gotten all the way through the vetting process.
Okay. The other thing that I wanted to ask you, and this is sort of inspired by questions that I've been getting from residents, is the idea held by a lot of people, and including yourself, correct me if I'm wrong, is that when it comes to local politics, especially at the city council level, party affiliation should not be sort of a determinant factor in, sort of, as we see at the larger level, people vote along party lines in the House of Representatives and Senate. And even at the state government level, there's people voting on party lines. But then when you get down to the local granular level of politics, it's sort of this notion that's held by many that, that we should sort of detach ourselves from parties and just focus on what's best for the residents. Now, it's no secret that with Allison's selection to the D1 role, you have 4 Democrats on council, and then you have yourself. And I'm curious to know, do you feel as sort of in the minority when it comes to party affiliation on the council? But B, and more importantly, I think, is this question of should party affiliation play any role in local politics at all? And is that sort of playing out in Encinitas now in sort of this majority-minority dynamic that we have?
So first of all, I'm a non-party preference, no party preference, NPP. Declared so, and formally years ago I was a Republican, although loosely I was probably voting Democrat as much as Republican. I worked for Maggie Houlihan, who was a Democrat on city council. I was her campaign manager for all 3 runs, so I was associated with Maggie for at least 12 years, if not more. So it has always been a nonpartisan role. A nonpartisan race. So what is a nonpartisan race? A partisan race, which we have, but not at the city level, but certainly at the state level, you have a primary. Now, California runs open primaries, and the history is a partisan race would have a primary where you get the best candidate, the most popular candidate from both parties, and then they run in the November race. So you have a June primary and a November race. This is a nonpartisan race. There is no primary. So there is it's not a 2-party system race, or it's not designed for a 2-party system race, yet it is being influenced very heavily by, as you say, party politics.
Encinitas.
Yeah. When I'm talking about the city council race in Encinitas. So I think that's a shame because we really want to get the best person for the job, and as I say, if I go back in a little decade or 2 in history here, we had Republicans, we had Democrats, we had independents, and quite frankly, you weren't always sure who was whom in the group. And a lot of Republicans I know were working with Maggie. Let's take former Supervisor Pam Slater-Price. She was a Republican. I think she's now a Democrat. She probably is an independent now. I don't know. I'll let her answer that question. But so down at the local level, I really believe it is nonpartisan, and it should be nonpartisan. And if it's not going to be, then we need to change to a partisan 2-party system race and have a primary.
Sure. Does this dynamic on the council now with 4 Democrats and then yourself, sort of, again, that majority-minority dynamic, does that concern you about sort of the policy direction that the council may be headed going forward?
Well, the fact they're Democrats doesn't concern me in the least. They as long as they vote what's right for the people of Encinitas, then we're fine. And it doesn't matter which race. As I said, Maggie was Democrat. It didn't matter. And so now we're going to have policy differences up there. I'm going to be a 3-1 vote or 4-1 vote now, probably. Although we don't know. I think each of them are individuals, and I think they're getting to know me. I'm getting to know them. One of my immediate interests was to get on the native plant ordinance because that's something near and dear to my heart, and that's an area where Joy and I have been collaborating, and I think Kelly, Joy, and I will collaborate, and I think we'll probably have, hopefully, unanimous council on that policy. But there may be other areas like local control and some of the what I would consider the state overreach or the applicability of Prop A, the right to vote on upzoning, where I'm clearly a strong advocate. And this council, or at least the three that were on the previous council, were less of an advocate for there. Although even in that case, when the city sued the proponents of Prop A, Tony voted no on that. So he was more on our side in that one case about the lawsuit. So hopefully all five of us up there are individuals, and we look at the greater good, the impact to the citizens of Encinitas, and go from there. I also hope that we follow the general plan, because the general plan was adopted over time. It is the city's constitution. I believe we have a very good general plan, and the question is, if they want to change the direction of the general plan, then they need to codify it. And one of the changes is the safety and mobility discussions. We need to look at that and see if the people of Encinitas agree with proposed changes, and we could get some policy differences there. I don't know yet.
Sure.
Yeah.
I want to move to housing. So and this is the principal topic in discussions leading up to this podcast, like with you, sort of back and forth.
Yeah. So we've been over some of this.
Yes, we've been over some of this already, you and I, and it appeared in the first podcast episode that you did with Pam back in, was it October, November? Anyhow.
And Pam Rodella that I was running against.
Your opponent.
Yeah.
Housing was the number one topic that we went over. And when we're talking about housing, specifically local control over housing and also housing density and low-cost, affordable housing. So there's a few things that I want to get to. So number one is, as you said yourself, you've been an outspoken advocate for local control. You were, correct me if I'm wrong, the principal author of Proposition A.
Correct.
Which required votes for zoning, for significant zoning changes.
For increases in zoning density or height.
Yes.
The prime two.
Yeah, no, let's get it out there. So the thing is now as a city council member, and you did your time on the planning commission, but now as a city council member,
You make it sound like a sentence.
Well, now that you're in office, what are the goals that you have for protecting local control, for sort of carrying the advocacy that you had as a citizen, as a planning commissioner? How do you carry that advocacy over into your role in District
that's a
4?
big, so that's a lot of why I'm here.
Yeah.
My reason for being is to allow the citizens of Encinitas to vote on future land use changes. That says a lot, right? I mean, that right there. And again, it's not that I'm a no growth. I never have been. If you look at my record on the Planning Commission, I supported the approval of projects in the R30 zone. I think there was one I voted no and I recused from one. The rest I voted yes for when they fit within the parameters of the approved zoning. So that's perfectly fine. Where I have trouble is when a landowner buys a piece of property, bids it up, thinking that they will likely get a zoning increase and therefore it will support that higher price. And that has the effect of causing speculation in land value, and land value goes up arbitrarily faster, especially for larger developers that can afford to do this, hold the property long enough to get it through the process of the upzoning. What Prop A did was require that the people be the final arbiter of that, not just a majority on the council. So going back a little in history, back to the general plan and how land would be upzoned before Prop A, it called for a vote of the people. The general plan before Prop A had the requirement of a vote of the people, but it had a loophole, one loophole or an out or whatever you want to call it, where 4/5 majority of the council could make a finding of public benefit and with a 4/5 supermajority vote to bypass the vote of the people. And this is the option that got taken every time, I believe, that they did zoning increases over the life, the duration of the city, the life of the city. And so Prop A just took out that loophole, basically, and it also reinstated the height limit of 2 stories, 30 feet. And by the way, the history of that is the 2 stories, 30 feet It goes back to our original general plan formulation. I found it in the minutes back, buried somewhere in the archives of the Encinitas
really did your
records.
research.
Yeah, and Greg Steele, who one of our original council members, said, "Hey, let's do the height limit in our original general plan of 2 stories, 30 feet." Came from the original prop. He called it Prop A, but it was actually Prop D in the San Diego beach areas. It was passed in 1972. So when we were passing Prop A, there were all these people saying, "Oh, it won't work, you'll have lawsuits." Well, guess what? That very same proposition, that the height limit and story limit, has been in place since 1972 and worked rather well in the beach areas. In fact, I think you see the sports arena went through or is either going through or went through a special election in order to allow going above that limit. So that's exactly how it was intended to work.
Yeah.
So, and I think we're seeing so far that Prop A is providing that safety valve.
Sure.
So.
One thing that I want to talk to you a bit about that came up in, again, conversations that we had before the episode's recording was this notion, or not this notion, but the concept of the no net loss rule, which, well, first of all, maybe just explain to people what that is, who might not be familiar. But secondly, can you talk about sort of going forward how, like, when we will need to rezone in order to avoid violating this rule, and what the consequences of that could be?
So, no net loss means that you have to have a buffer of zoning that will support the, you have the capacity to build lower income units. Lower income meaning 80% or below of the average median income in San Diego. Just FYI, the average median income in San Diego County is $106,000 this year. That means 85% of that is somewhere in the mid to upper 80s for a family of 4. And depending whether it's a family of 2 or 6, and a single person, the AMI threshold varies from there. But just give you an idea, we're not talking, we're talking quite a few people in Encinitas would fall in that category and qualify to live in that housing. So for the no net loss concept, when we finally got our housing element certified, it was done so through a rezoning that provided thousands, I want to say 2,000, 1,800 housing units of these lower income qualified. We always build and have plenty of capacity for above moderate. So the the luxury condos and luxury houses, we produce plenty of units. We have capacity for plenty more. The state says we qualify there. The only place that they look at our housing element is for low and very low, which collectively the state will call lower. So when you hear me say lower, that's what that means. There's one in between that's called moderate, and we usually have enough for that, but we don't have a lot of extra. But they haven't really been regulating there. So to avoid a no net loss, you have to have a buffer. You have to have a capacity available, and we zone 2,000 roughly units. But each one of the projects, these 15 housing element projects around the town, examples would be Fox Point Farms, Sunshine, Goodson, Clark, several, 1967 Vulcan. These are all part of those R30 housing element projects that were upzoned. They were upzoned at a density the state deems as the default density for low income. So when they were upzoned, 100% of the units counted towards our assessment. It's called a RENA assessment. I won't get too technical here, but when they're being built, our current requirement in the city of Encinitas is that 15% should be lower income. So we only get credit then for 15%, or sometimes it's 20% if that's what the builder built, because they get, and the remaining 80 or 85% comes out of that buffer. And so what's happening to the buffer is it's declining rapidly. And I can't predict the future because it all depends on how quickly the remaining projects, but out of the 15 projects that were upzoned, at least 10 now are either approved and started construction, or they're well through the application process. And if we got through all 15, we would easily be below
In violation.
in violation of the no net loss, and we would have to, if we go below zero of our buffer, we have 180 days to rezone
Okay.
for
Yeah.
additional capacity. And so the question is, how long would it take to go through the proper rezoning process of selecting of, in our case now, because of Prop A, we'd have to go through a vote. So it behooves us to start earlier and identify those spots.
Yeah.
So
So, and by the way, just for the record, for people who might not know the context, you opposed that 50%, right? You thought we could do better.
yeah, well, and and it wasn't me. It was the Planning Commission as a whole. The Planning Commission
Recommended
unanimously
50, right?
recommended 50.
50% inclusionary.
And the City Council reversed that, went back to the original 15-20. And I always thought that 50, because there are other cities in the state that chose 50. If you didn't agree with 50, then maybe the number's 40, 45, 35. I don't know. All of them have a very good, two very good outcomes that I really appreciate. One is it requires much less equivalent market rate. So every time you build the 15%, you have to build 6 times the number of market rate in order to achieve that low income. And if you're trying to achieve our numbers of required low income, then it's going to take a lot more market rate to get you there. And that means a lot more traffic overall.
More for development.
Quite frankly, it means you chew up more land, then less is available for future low income too, or lower income. And if you get a higher percentage, then the ratio, instead of being 6-to-1, is maybe 3-to-1, 2-to-1, 1-to-1 ideally. But let's say it's 2-to-1, and then for every lower income, you're only building maybe 1, 2, 3 market rate, not 6. So
Yeah.
it's less impact to our quality of life.
More efficient.
And more efficient, yeah. But what it does, it costs more from the developer. But we essentially gave them a free upgrade. We gave them, the land was sitting there. It was at whatever, RR2, RR5, whatever the property was beforehand. That's 2 per acre, 5 per acre, and then we upped it where they could put 30 units per acre. So they were making a lot more money, where some of the examples that we discussed at Planning Commission, and this was an analysis done by a city consultant, the value of the land went up by $5 million alone, and the developer rights went up, it was 25 to 35 million on the one example we discussed thoroughly. So there was a lot of value added to those lots, and no additional percentage of lower income was required out of those lots.
So moving forward, in order to avoid any potential penalties for failing to meet these affordable housing requirements, what I'm curious about is, where do we put this next round of upzoning, and essentially how much is going to be enough?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
And so for that, I believe in doing the public business in the public forum. So that policy discussion should occur at the council meeting in the public forum, where we decide how much do we need, when do we think we're going to need it. It probably has to happen sooner, not later, because we're going to need the time to go through the process to get through the identification and the upzone and be ready before we hit zero. And included in that discussion is, how many units do we think we need? So prior to the election, the city started a El Camino Real task force, El Camino Real specific plan task force. What's that mean? That means they're looking at adding housing on top of the commercial, or the potential to add housing on the commercial up and down El Camino Real. Basically from LA Fitness on the south end all the way to Walmart on the north end, and the entire, and so I attended every one of those meetings. I wasn't on Planning Commission. I wasn't on City Council, obviously. I attended them because they're open public meetings, as they should be, and that I applaud that. That's great. And one of the comments made by staff was that we don't need this for the housing element. I thought that was,
Don't need El Camino.
We don't need the El Camino upzone, and I don't know what we need it for then. They keep talking about mobility improvements along El Camino Real, and here
buy
maybe a linear park or something, but I don't see the big carrot that would justify this kind of increased number of housing units on one of our busiest traffic corridors. And so I'm not opposed to doing some along there, but I don't see the need to upzone all of it.
If we're going to have increased density, increased congestion, traffic, other issues associated with adding more housing elements along El Camino, your question is, why aren't we using this the right way? Why aren't we using this towards counting for our housing element?
Well, I think the intent, I actually think it will get used for that. And
that's a good thing.
And it's a necessary thing, but I think the scale is much larger than what I would support. And I don't know where the rest of the council stands. And I would love to, it's time to get it out in front of the council and the people, and so we can all give better direction to the process and scale it to an appropriate size and locate it, go through the same public process we did prior to the Measure T, where we decided the discussions of where. Historically, to date, the previous councils have always said, spread out the pain throughout the city. Now, unfortunately, the way it came down, Northwest Leucadia, in my opinion, got hammered. And I think most people would not disagree with that. Hence the focus on infrastructure now for Northwest Leucadia and for all of the city to help mitigate some of these projects we are putting in and the associated traffic and et cetera.
Yeah, so what I want to know is, if we do end up upzoning the El Camino Rail Corridor, what does that look like in your opinion, or what should that look like?
So I would choose judiciously where the upzoning goes, and I'm not a big fan of housing on top of commercial, especially retail.
You're talking about housing physically located on top
physically,
of
right on
commercial.
top, yeah. You know, where you go bottom floor, because
Yeah.
if you look around at the examples in Encinitas and San Marcos, the retail doesn't seem to do as well as people always predict. I'm a fan of laterally doing it, where you have smaller retail closer to the road, and the buffer zone between that retail and the housing, say along, if we choose El Camino Real as an example, would be multi-story housing. And I would want to keep that similar to our current R30 zoning, which is 3 stories. Of course, when I say 3 stories, what happens in practicality with density bonus and the other state programs, they usually get to go at least 1, sometimes 2 stories above that. So I'm always very careful on the height, and we lose control quickly about height with waivers associated with what's called density bonus and the state law.
Sure. What are some things that the city can do to?
Can I didn't get to finish. I forgot part of the response. You said where. I don't know where. I think that is a policy decision that the council as a whole, with lots of input from neighbors in District 1 and in District, just about every district borders this portion of the El Camino Real. I think we should do it very sparingly. I don't want to do the entire length. There are thousands of potential units that would result from that, and that's by the city's own numbers. I would rather see it done so that we have commercial districts that remain commercial districts intact, at anchoring either end, probably in the middle. And I think there's some, I'll call it lesser utilized, underutilized parcels in the middle that I think would be prime candidates to turn part of them into to residential apartments, and thereby be near those commercial cores, and people could walk to them easily. This concept that we're going to have walkability from Walmart to Ralph's, how many people are going to walk that distance? Bike ride, yes, but I think that is the walkability. We want to keep it more compact.
Sure.
And connect housing directly there. So I would support, potentially, depending on the details, doing smaller projects, smaller rezone in a couple of areas along El Camino Real where currently I'd say the real estate is underutilized.
Sure. For the purposes of time, I want to talk a bit about the Our Neighborhood Voices initiative while we're still on housing, which is it didn't make it in 2022. The initiative didn't
Yeah, it got
reach.
pulled back by the authors.
Yeah, so it didn't reach voters, but in 2024, it may well reach voters, and you have. And by the way, just for some context, this is also known as the Brand Huang Mendoza Initiative.
Yes.
Yeah, and
if you can remember that.
If you have
Brand being the name of the mayor of Redondo, and the other two being
two other
either
cities.
council members or mayors around the state.
I'm blanking on the two other cities, but
Me too.
it overturns SB 9 and 10. And
Does it directly overturn it? I don't believe that's true.
I believe it does.
Okay.
So the 2024, if it reaches the ballot in 2024, sort of like how would you, like, do you support this and why is the
I
question?
support it in concept. I supported it when it was proposed in 2022. It didn't. I don't remember it directly attacking SB 9, but regardless, it didn't. It got pulled before it even got through the signature. So the first step is you have to get the people in the state will have to gather enough signatures to qualify for the ballot, and then there'll be an election to determine whether or not it is enacted by the people. So I certainly support getting something like this on the ballot for 2024, or sometime in 2024, and probably for the general election. And but it has to have certain characteristics. One, it needs to not impact CEQA. It cannot, and that was one of the complaints of the 2022 version. The authors didn't believe it would could be used to circumvent CEQA, which is the Environmental Quality Act, and EIRs and that process. But other people did, and so I think that's one reason it got pulled. There may have been other reasons, since I'm not that close to it. But I certainly am open to it. Tony Kranz, last year was it, or in 2022, 2021, he actually had a council-initiated item where he asked for support on the old version. And hopefully he'll be there to do it again with me. And if I have to, I'll do the same thing he did to try and get support. Now that's subject to my reviewing the document when it's in front of us.
Yeah.
So.
And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that Joy Lyons has expressed her opposition to SB 9 and 10 as well.
That I don't know.
And you mentioned
to SB 9 and 10. Oh,
yeah.
Wow. No,
and Kranz has said what he said, and now you. So it seems like at least 3 council members are sort of on board with this. Like, would you favor a resolution endorsing the initiative if it came up?
Well, so the primary purpose of the Our Neighborhood Voices initiative is to return local control to the cities.
Yeah.
So it's not just SB 9, SB 10 that have usurped that control. It is everything from density bonus law to the Housing Accountability Act, which is a collection of many, many different housing laws on as far as everything from streamlining to by right approval. I'll talk a little bit about by right approval in that if a project qualifies for by right approval, all the discretionary ability of a city or a planning commission are taken away, and it becomes what's called legally a ministerial decision. Almost a rubber stamp. The city does not, unless it is a threat to health and safety of the residents, or unless it's directly impacting like historical.
Heritage site or something.
Heritage site, yeah. It gets the city has no choice but to approve. So
and it undercuts like a lot of, and it goes by a lot of environmental and other restrictions.
So that's the negative side of the SB 9s and the housing and some of the Housing Accountability Act. So the intent and purpose of Our Neighborhood Voices initiative is to restore that power and balance it. And if you look back at the history of the state, do you remember, well, back, I want to say in the early 2000s and even in the 1990s, there was a whole funding issue where the state was borrowing receipts and then at one point they wouldn't give them back. And the initiative process was used to restore the local entities' rights to that money. And this to me is kind of the same battle going on, repeating itself, where what I would consider an overreach by the state government needs to be pushed back on. And so our Neighborhood Voices initiative is a step in that direction. And depending on how it's exactly written, I believe I'll support it, but I want to see it in detail too.
Fair enough.
So,
related to housing, sort of is, well, not exactly, but I just want to take a step back. Like when you look at the past few months, I mean, we actually got some rain for a change in December, and a little bit in January as well. Not as much as they did up north, but the reason I bring up the rain is in Leucadia for decades has been this issue of flooding, and you have now a situation. Well, let me take a step back even further. And in April, the Coast News actually came out with an article about the city's liability for flooding. And essentially this notion of inverse condemnation theory, which I'll just briefly explain, which is that a city can be held liable for damages caused to downstream properties when water is unnaturally diverted. And I know you specifically said before this conversation that you can't talk about liability, and I respect that. But given the fact that people are frustrated about this, and I'm interviewing a resident tomorrow whose home suffered $100,000 in damages from the flooding that happened on New Year's Eve, I believe. And it's not just even the people whose houses were damaged, it's also people who are frustrated about the streets being flooded, not being able to get in touch with Public Works. And I'm just sort of curious to know like what you make of this, like, and what sort of solutions you support for getting Leucadia back on track.
wow. So this is a big problem, been around for decades, right? And I'm not necessarily an expert in it, but I'll tell you what I do know, and I plan to learn more. First of all, I support finding a long-term permanent solution, and that permanent solution may come in steps, and some of the steps have occurred, but not the big steps. So I thought the Coast News article from April, probably the best write-up of the situation I'd seen. Everything from citing the grand jury findings from 2012, I believe it was, to quoting all the right people like Gary Murphy, who is probably the resident expert. He lives right there, has lived there forever.
Yeah.
He can tell you chapter and verse about what's going on, what's happened, and what needs to happen, what didn't happen. So I support allocating funds and acquiring grants to solve this problem as one of the highest priorities in the city of Encinitas. We're old enough of a city, and this problem's been there long enough, festering, and it's going to cause real property damage. Again, I not briefed on it. I haven't talked to the city attorney, so I'm not going anywhere near talking about whose liability is what. That has been handled before I got here, and I will learn more as I move forward. I've had four council meetings so far.
Sure.
So solutions. I was intrigued by, I believe one solution is to properly use the diverter. I'll try not to get too technical. I would put a link to the article because I think it was a fantastic article. Properly operate the inverter that would prevent the water from getting across the railroad tracks, and therefore not swamping the undersized outfall to Bataquitos Lagoon, the 42-inch. And number two, I do believe that we should try and mimic the natural flow. So the south end of Leucadia should drain as it would have naturally drained into Cottonwood Creek, but that would require capital improvements and funding, probably funding that is beyond the limits of what the city would be able to fund. So that's why the grants. So
right now that water goes north towards Ponto.
Right now the water goes north from Orpheus or so. And again, I am not the expert here, but I can see the need to solve this problem long term. It's been flooding for a very, very long time. And then the other problem that was well covered in the article was the pumping. In the case of rain, flood, heavy, 100-year, 50-year rain events, pumping the water up and over, and there's currently a pipe that goes all the way down to the beach, so you're pumping direct rainfall runoff with whatever wash-off toxins come from roads, et cetera, directly onto the beach. And that's one of the main reasons to solve this. Number two reason, of course, is causing property damage and both to city and to private entities. So
Yeah.
it is a problem that needs to be addressed, and I support addressing it. And it's, I believe this will be a not a short-term solution, but you got to keep making the steps and have a plan to get to the funding and get to the solutions. And
Yeah.
so each one of those components, and like I say, read the article. That was a great article.
Yeah, we'll put a link to it in the episode or something. But
and if you can't do that, go talk to Gary Murphy, and he'll tell you everything you need to know.
I can attest to that.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Lucadia Streetscape Drainage Improvements Project that Tony's sort of been touting, or?
Not in detail, not
Yeah.
enough, not enough to tell you what it does. I remember when Streetscape was in front of the Planning Commission. I was on the Planning Commission. That was a component of it.
Yeah, it's
but,
an addendum to Streetscape.
Yeah, but has it been passed? That's what I don't know. Was it approved as part of Streetscape? And so
Well, it's been subsequently approved. I just got actually a message from Mike Levin's office on his email list or whatever that there was $4 million that the city received for the improvements project, for the drainage improvements project. So it's been approved, but the thing is that I just want to know, and maybe this is a conversation for next time, sort of where the council members stand on the feasibility of this project. If you talk to Gary, he's not a fan. But I just want to sort of know how you think the city is handling this.
So this, and I don't really have an opinion because it predates me being on the council or hearing any briefing about it. So
Fair enough.
not quite sure.
Yeah, we want to move on, which I think the number one thing that I talk about probably the most talked about topic on every single podcast that I do is where the city's at with its homelessness situation. We talked about this in the first episode with you and Pam, and the numbers, we've already been over it. The city last year came out with a report, or Sandag came out with a report that showed that, from 2020 to 2022, essentially, there was a 74% rise in homelessness in Encinitas, which is considerable, even compared to neighboring cities, Del Mar, Solana Beach, Carlsbad. It's one thing to talk about it as a private citizen, but now you're on council, and you're sort of on the inside of these discussions. You're considering policy solutions. Can you sort of give us that insider's perspective of what are the conversations going on? We have the city has a homeless action plan, but what is sort of the way you see this playing out in months and years to come?
So since I got sworn in on December 14th, there haven't been, December 13th actually, there haven't been any council discussions about homelessness and addressing it. So there's, I guess, from that respect, no new information. However, as soon as I started running, obviously I knew planning and planning commission issues, which is a pretty good portion of the load, and I understand a lot of the finance and budgetary concerns at the city because I've followed those year to year. But I didn't have personal knowledge in homelessness other than seeing some of them on the streets. So I immediately started reading and researching and reading books about it. I had the great fortune to have a long conversation with Bob McElroy from Alpha Project. And if you know Alpha Project, they're probably one of the largest homeless, it's really a homeless and treatment program to help people get back on their feet, especially drug addicted and anybody with a psychosis. And so it was an eye opener talking to him. And his comment to me, and this is confirmed in books I'd read, is that roughly 2/3, maybe even 70% in San Francisco of the people on the street are either drug addicted, alcohol induced psychosis, or purely psychotic, and that there are when people get into homelessness, and there are so many different causes, you can't treat them all as one. It's not one solution fits everybody. You've got youth, you've got domestic violence victims, primarily women. You've got families. You've got veterans. And I usually, based on what I've read, I then separate those out from the the alcohol, drug, and psychosis groups that are harder to treat. I think the solutions for the families and domestic violence and youth and et cetera, they're pretty well understood because these people want to get off the streets and you can really help them. Not everybody here wants to get off the street per se. And when I say that, what I mean, when offered treatment and services, if it includes getting sober, they tend to decline based on what I've been told by people like Bob at Alpha Project and by reading some of the books on it. So the trick is, how do you get those people treated and
refuse to be treated?
Who if they refuse to be treated. And so I did a ride along also as part of my running with our local sheriffs, and as expected, I chose Saturday night on purpose. I think I talked about this during our last podcast.
You did.
And so real quick, I got to watch the officer offer the services in the most empathetic way, and 2 times that I got that night, refused right then and there, and no, I'll just move on. But it was impressive, and the way, as I said that night, it rolled off his tongue so smoothly that it wasn't rehearsed for me. It's what he did. I believe it's what he did every time, and so, I'll go one last comment on this would be that talking to the head of Alpha Project, he calls the out of that group, he calls the ones that are willing to go in and try treatment unicorns. They're that rare. And so his goal is, of his program, is to get the unicorns into offer treatment and housing and whatnot, and get them going on a contingent housing solution until they can work their way up to full housing. And he, unfortunately, it's a small percentage out of that 2/3 that will accept it. And of the people that they treat, 50% are successful. Some go through multiple times and then are successful the second time. And so, that's one component. But the big open question in my mind, and I don't have the solution, I don't think anybody does, is how do you treat the people who are continually refusing treatment, and how do we care for them while at the same time protecting the rights of the general population in order to enjoy safety and security out on the street. And it's a hard problem.
Yeah. Well, I want to make a note there. So you have, as you said, like these unicorns who are seeking treatment, and then you have the majority of people who are being offered treatment that are refusing.
Yeah, and they may not be seeking treatment, but they at least agree to go through it.
Sure.
Yeah.
You have a majority, though, that is essentially saying no thank you to these services. And I think that the underlying, what we can safely assume, based on research that I've done and the conversations I've had even on this podcast with other experts, is that a good number of the people who are refusing services are mentally ill, are addicted to drugs or alcohol, and are facing these other underlying conditions. So my question is, I guess, it's rhetorical and literal, which is like, is that a sustainable model to only essentially offer treatment to those who want it? Because the other flip side to that is this notion of involuntary treatment, conservatorships.
Yeah, conservatorship.
And that is something that's been highly touted even at the state level now with the CARE program. And the council members have kind of expressed different views to me about how they feel about conservatorships, involuntary treatment, and I don't think that's a question I've asked you, so I wanted to get you to weigh in.
I think they're going to, if they are a possible harm to themselves or significant threat of harm to themselves or others, which I think we see that happening in public. I mean, even Mayor Krantz was attacked once. I had somebody come up, and I'm a big guy, I'm 265, 6'2", and when a homeless guy came up and was hassling me for a ride, and this was during COVID, and I had my mask on, he didn't, and I was and he was out in the middle of the street kind of stumbling and very aggressive. But, when I immediately thought, what happens if my wife or my daughters were confronted? He's got a right to be there. He's got a right to be on the street. I support that. But he doesn't have a right to intimidate other people. And so where I think the conservatorship is probably a very limited case of people that can't function at all out there in society. But on the other hand, we do need to enforce our laws. Defecating in public, causing public safety issues, interfering with traffic. I watched one homeless person walking down the middle of El Camino Real, in apparently homeless person, but he certainly looked that way, in a rainstorm, in the middle of traffic. And that, you can't allow that to happen. That you have to enforce those laws. Certainly any battery or assault has to be enforced. So we need to be able to enforce
Sure.
the order. Do
you feel like enforcement has been an issue for Encinitas?
I probably don't know enough to comment on that. I haven't been in on those discussions. I will be looking to see. In some cases, like when I went on my ride around again, this is one or two deputies, and they would say, well, it has been hard to they really don't go forward, and the district attorney doesn't prosecute petty crimes anymore, because
And that's a reflection of state law.
that's the state law, and that was initiative law, right? Prop 47.
Yeah.
That lowered that threshold, or raised that threshold to $900 and some odd. And so maybe rethinking that threshold would be a good idea, because I believe there have been ill effects from that decision.
Moving on for time, I wanted to address the other thing that people were kind of sort of pushing me to ask you about in this conversation, which was the question of at-grade crossings, and specifically, do you support? Well, first of all, for people who aren't familiar with your views, can you sort of explain, do you even support an at-grade crossing in theory, and why? And where at this point do you feel, if so, do you feel they should go?
Yeah. So I do.
Yeah.
I grew up at-grade crossings all through Chicago. And most of them did not have gates even. They just had sounders. So I have no problem with at-grade crossings. I think what's being proposed, we just had a report during informational items on one of the recent council meetings about the plans or efforts to put in 2 more at-grade crossings in Leucadia. And the proposal, and I support this completely. I support 2 things: at-grade crossings, or I should say crossings to get us safely from one side of the east side of the tracks to the west side, so people have access to the ocean and have access to the businesses down there without having to walk a mile down and a mile back.
Or illegally.
Or illegally cross.
And
We have the evidence they presented that night is that we have ample evidence. I think it was on a Saturday of, I want to say, 200 illegal crossings in the gap served by that they observed, and they take this now to the federal authorities to show the need for a crossing. So hopefully that'll do the trick, and we can get federal approval for at-grade crossings. The current proposal is for 2 roughly spaced a half mile south of La Costa, where there's La Costa Boulevard, where there's a crossing, and a half mile north, or maybe it's 3/10 north of Leucadia Boulevard. So it ends up dividing that segment into rough thirds, which I think is appropriate. Now, the exact location hasn't been decided. One of the things that I brought up at the meeting, I'm also an advocate, and this goes a bit hand in hand, of achieving a quiet zone in Leucadia, much like Cardiff did for train horns. Now, the segment technically it goes to the next neighboring zone of. So, in order to achieve a quiet zone, we have to get Carlsbad to implement the quiet zone on the southern portion of theirs, and so it's maybe I wouldn't gate the at-grade crossings on quiet zone. But there are certain capital improvements that can be put into the quiet zone that will make it very easy then to implement sorry, I said that backwards. There are certain improvements, cabling and towers and whatnot, sounders, that can be built into the crossing that would then be required if and when we get to a quiet zone approval, or the ability to apply for a quiet zone. So I support doing both.
Sure.
And getting both done as fast as reasonably possible.
And an engineering representative for the city talked about how he wants to do something similar to the model they have in Redlands, I believe, with the at-grade crossings, which includes descending gate arms and flashing lights warning of an approaching train. Do you, have you sort of reviewed staff's analysis and concept designs? What are your thoughts as far as, just what this could look like in detail?
I saw a couple of plans and proposals from, I want to say 6 months ago. And so I'd read that prior to getting elected. Had the informational, so I wouldn't, it was nothing like when planning commission is great. I've got all the detailed drawings, I got all the reports, I get a chance to sit down with staff. I haven't had that opportunity here yet in just 4 meetings.
Yeah.
So I'm the detail guy, right? I'm going to go through it in detail when it does land before
You're the detail
us.
guy, but you're also the new guy. you're getting settled in.
New guy that's been around for 25 years doing this. So,
but newish on the council, and that's one thing. Is as we close, is just like I'm curious to know, moving forward, what aside from what we've talked about, just what are your goals and dreams? What do the next couple of years look like for you?
Well, I think we talked about a lot of my key. It's the things that I campaigned on, exactly. Number one was local control.
Yeah.
Number one, environment, which is native plants, but it's also preserving as much of our natural environment as we possibly can. So acquiring open space would be big for me. Public safety, and that has everything to do from reducing crime. And when I talk about that, I'm not, homelessness is a component, not necessarily crime.
Yeah.
But that's certainly public safety and health. And then, but we also have crime sprees, that the organized crime people breaking into houses around Encinitas. So I'm a big supporter for the deputies and the fire department. Public safety also includes the wildfire, which we didn't talk about, but I believe we need to upgrade our wildfire evacuation plan. And we can,
in Olivenhain, you're talking about.
In Olivenhain in particular, but I think that probably is germane to more than just Olivenhain, because there are other parts of the city that have natural, but Olivenhain clearly is the one at the front end of a Santa Ana event where the fires, and historically it's where fires have occurred. So, and then open government is probably the last area that, not last area, but it's one of the big ones where I really am a firm believer in the public business, doing the public business, the public forum, being able to do Public Records Act requests or see what email communications are going on within the city. Obviously, there's certain classes such as real estate negotiation and personnel issues that will be private and should be private.
Yeah.
So, but all other should be open game, and that's the intent of the Brown Act.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's part of why you're here, is because you, and even before you're on council, you've never turned down an interview. You've never turned down an opportunity to, speak
get
your
in front
mind.
of the cameras, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't really see it necessarily as a desire for attention, but it's more of just as you said, believing in and doing the public business in the public forum, and specifically in letting people know this is how their government is working, and this is what we're working towards, and this is the direction that the council's taking. So I really appreciate you doing stuff like this personally.
Well, and I'll go a step further. I mean, I knocked personally on 1,200 or 1,500 doors in D4. My team knocked on every door
during the election
at least once, except the back end of Liebenheim. I wrote letters to all those people. Someday I may walk out there again. I have done that in past elections. I've been walking Encinitas neighborhoods for 25 years, at least 20. Working on Maggie's campaign, several other city council members. So I'm very familiar with most every street in the city. It's funny, we're over in New Encinitas here. I used to live right around the corner.
Yeah.
So,
well, hey, the thing that I'll say last of all is I hope there's a part 3 or a part 4 in the next couple of years.
When there's news to talk about.
Yes, when there's more stuff coming in. As you get more settled into the job, we'll keep doing this. And we have other episodes coming up with some of your fellow council members.
Yep.
So thanks so much for coming on, Bruce. I appreciate you. And best of luck in these next couple of years. So
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been another recorded episode of Stay Classy San Diego with your host, Steve Wire. Thanks again to our sponsor, MaxLux Media at maxluxmedia.com. And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning to the show. See you next time. Stay classy, San Diego.